My pranams to this wonderful effort of Shri Vishnu Mohan Foundation. I'm feeling so strengthened that Swami Shri Hari Prasad ji is right sitting here throughout. I've been seeing him on screen for hours, and that's very inspiring. And to the founder and to the wonderful team that is making this happen. And it is this is a kind of program which is very close to my heart, because usually when we are in academics, what happens is religion becomes a part and parcel of the personal life, and you're not allowed to discuss that in academic fields, because that is completely, I won't say completely, but very heavily influenced by the materialist forces. At the same time, there are very good contributions of materialist thoughts like socioeconomic development and so much. So somewhere a person who's actively participating in academics becomes fragmented. So a program like this is so nourishing and enriching, because until and unless Paravidya and Aparavidya are ready to come together and shake hands, forget about sustainability, there can be no good to the world. So thank you for organizing this. And I'd like to come to my topic. I've been a practicing teacher for about a decade, and just over a decade in higher education. And I'm majorly going to speak from my experiences of interacting with the higher education institution. That includes colleges and universities, and take up data from definitely international and national levels, and of course, from universities across the country. So the topic, the overarching topic is education, the right kind of education and sustainable development. Now, beginning from where the topic has led us to, that is sustainable development. We have seen over and over again the sustainable development documents, the United Nations, all have emphasized on the value of youth earlier, and they want to come up with a kind of education where the youth will be helpful for sustainable development. In earlier Millennium Development Goals, we had education majorly for skill development, for employability. But there's been a major shift in the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015, where youth are not only recipients of sustainable development, but they have been acknowledged as active participants. That is, on their shoulders, Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved. And then document after document of the United Nations, of Sustainable Development Growth, and the Agenda 2030 documents, full of highlighting the role of the youth. And then there are multiple goals, goal 3, goal 4, its subparts, goal 16, gives so much of emphasis on the importance of youth. Now, coming to the national scene, we also see a lot of importance given to the youth and tertiary education. We know as a person moves into the youth phase and especially reaches adulthood, 18, 19, 20, college becomes important, universities become important. So in India, we are more comfortable in calling that higher education institutes. In the UN language, it is tertiary education. All that becomes very important. So it is of prime importance to look into the quality of tertiary education or higher education as well. United Nations have been very explicitly speaking about primary and secondary education. That is not because they are more, they are more important. Probably that is because the goals have not been reached as yet. But it's time that we also start speaking about tertiary education, higher education, and its quality and its style of delivery. My presentation would be actually circling around how to strengthen higher education institutes, especially one very important component of it. That is the quality of teachers, That is the first component. And second component, the overall environment in the institute. Because if we are talking about sustainability, if we are talking about retaining more and more students inside the higher education institute, we have to talk about how it is delivered. There are many other important factors, but my focus is this too. Now, to begin with, a quick look at what is the status of youth participation in higher education institutes. We see youth participation, if you call it enrollment rate or whatever, that is very slowly increasing in higher education. We have the different reports of the government of India, and they point to the fact that it is crawling ahead. It is just a very slow growth, but there is a growth. That's the first feature. Second feature is not only there's a growth, the good news is the growth of participation in higher education is a little higher. Sorry, the growth percentage of disadvantaged sections who have been otherwise disadvantaged for many, let's say centuries or decades, their growth and their participation in higher education is marginally faster than the general population. But overall, the growth is slow. So that is the second feature of importance. So with these two features, I think we all will agree that there is a need to not only increase the enrollment rate, but also increase the retention so that youth stays back in higher education, because that's the basics of sustainability. And then we can go on to the quality of education and quality of educators. So we have to retain the youth in HEIs. Now, are we as teachers and as staff members of higher education institutes actually prepared for this growth? That is my area, because my experiences say that there's not much talk about preparation of teaching and non-teaching staff. Because unless the teaching and non-teaching staff are oriented to actually invite this change into the institutes, whatever little change is happening, that will not sustain. The main thing to get prepared about is the main question that I have, and where I find a lacune, that is, with increasing number of students from disadvantaged sections coming into higher education, are we as teachers and staff have the skill to train them? And I'll come to the question, the questions I'm raising, I'll try to answer them from my experience and data, and then maybe keep some questions open. The second feature that I want to draw attention to is the population of students who are increasingly coming into higher education. What is their mental health status? And are we equipped to handle that mental health status? That is my second area of deliberation. Now, I pointed out to the features of students coming into the higher education. We find students, it's a good news, because any kind of, whenever we are talking about reaching sustainable development goals, we're always checking our data on how many disadvantaged sections are moving in and how fast. And the good news is more students from the scheduled caste section, more students from the scheduled tribe section. And if comparatively, because of patriarchal social setup, if somebody considers women as a comparatively a section that did not have some advantage for centuries, Even compared to men, the rate of coming into HEIs, higher education institutions, women are doing better. That is the participation part. Now coming to the mental health part, I'm actually very pained to share that it is a very sad story. Report after report, you name it, reports of NIMHANS, report of Government of India, report of National Crime Record Bureau, who keep report on statistics, on suicide rates. Everywhere we find the youth are actually struggling very hard with mental health. Okay, and just to give some idea, I'd like to share some statistics here. That is, unfortunately, when we talk about mental health, sometimes we have to start with the suicide rate. That's not a very healthy practice, because mental health and its illnesses and its struggles are way beyond that. But sometimes that's shared to quickly give a vision of the whole thing. Suicide rates has been steadily rising in India, and the latest National Crime Records Bureau has released a report in 2020, and it says 67% of all suicide rates are actually young adults, which is the age group of 18 to 45 years. And if you think about college and university education, a big section of this population comes to these higher education institutions. And very unfortunately, on one hand, the IITs and IIMs have been centers of excellence with regard to education. At the same time, somehow they've also been in the news for all the wrong reasons, like a very high suicide rate. 27 students across 10 Indian institutes of technology, that is IIT, committed suicide between 2014 to 2019. That is, only in 5 years, 27 students only in the IITs have committed suicide. Another, and now I'm coming to general mental health of students. That includes a part of school education. That is, this is again very sad news. Every hour, one student commits suicide in India. And 28 such suicides reported every day. That is according to National Crime Records Bureau. And this has been rising. So this was just the context where I will raise some questions. And I get back to my question. As we, as teachers, as office staff, as administrators, really skilled to deal with this kind of student population. Now, my personal experience of over a decade says we are not. There are few things that are taken for granted for the teaching community. Let me start with the teaching community, because that is where my first-hand experience comes from, and then I'll go to the non-teaching community. Teachers, there are some dangerous things we take for granted about them. Once, this is a kind of self-analysis that I'm doing, once we move into teaching, it's kind of that we go to a place of no questions, that I'm qualified, I have a degree, a doctorate, and I'm in a power position in the academic structure. I will teach, so I'm somewhere here, and the students will listen. So somewhere, somebody who is higher up in the power, for example, teachers, very silently go out of questioning about quality, about whether they are equipped. And we, for all the problems, we have a tendency of pointing it to the students. I really thank my previous speakers, and especially I was hearing about Dr. Chaudhary, and thank you for shifting the focus towards teachers. Now let us question ourselves. I will point out certain areas where teachers of higher education do not receive any training. And I find that is dangerous. Why dangerous? Because that is silently pushing a lot of students towards dropout. And that is also silently pushing a lot of students towards suicide. Okay, and a part of the answer, why do we have such a slow growth rate in higher education, may lie in this. That is my hope. So, number one, we have increasing students coming from the disadvantaged sections. This means that students, many of them are first generation learners, that maybe in their whole mohalla or maybe in their whole village, in their family, of course, nobody else had gone through higher education before that. Now, I as a teacher, and teachers, I can say for many teachers across the country, across institutes, have not received any formal training for a cultural understanding of such students. It does not happen automatically. What teachers forget is teaching is an extremely complex psychological process. This teaching learning psychology is complex. And it varies as per social class, gender, and all the social divisions, it varies. So, number one, teachers of higher education are not trained into teaching learning psychology of students coming from disadvantaged sections. You may question me, why is that important? Let me give you small examples. Handling a student who has come from, who is not a first generation learner. Let's say her father and her grandparents all have gone through college education. That student will be way more equipped to receive a teacher's education, will have many more learning skills, how to prepare notes, which books to refer, how to use the library. And there are so many other finer skills that come into functioning when a student learns. After that, how to prepare for examination, practices in concentration. And I can go on saying that students of disadvantaged sections do not automatically come from. And that is where the teachers need training. Another thing, while teaching, I say again and again, as school teachers, a person has to go through the B.Ed degree. And there's still some scope for training in education psychology. It's on pen and paper, but there's still some hope. But in higher education, when you give set or net or you step into the precincts, there's very superficial few questions that you have to learn by heart about how to teach. And then in the question paper, there will be tic-tac-toe MCQs on teaching learning, and that's it. So teachers in higher education have to get equipped there. It is not easy. Students in higher education who are coming from disadvantaged sections will also have lesser vocabulary in academics. That means it is more difficult to explain concepts there. To explain concepts which are there in the curriculum, and the curriculum has been made from here, not grassroots up. A teacher has to be extremely skilled to break down those concepts to the level of the student. Now, we do not question where does this come from. It is a gifted teacher who can brilliantly do it, or the teacher does not do it, and there is no system to question that. What saddens me is, in higher education, not many people will ask you how good you are teaching. There's this mad culture of publish and perish. Everybody's asking each other, which conference you went to, which research papers have you published? Very good. That is needed. But when we are thinking of helping more and more disadvantaged students into higher education, along with research skills, we need teaching skills. We cannot ignore that. We cannot take that for granted. And then when students are not able to perform, we penalize them. We put the load upon them that it is your fault. This is one area of extreme, serious thought at the policy level, at the implementation level. Another thing that I faced while teaching disadvantaged sections, let me tell you where my experience comes from. I come from a college where majority are first generation learners. So where did I have to train myself? And there was no formal support. I had to train myself, and by the blessings of God, at least I could identify that this is where I have to train myself. Again, you can understand that I've completed higher education, and there are more chances that my ancestors have completed higher education for at least 3 to 4 generations. And I came from a socioeconomic group which was considered to be more privileged. Okay. So the language I was speaking, the examples that I was giving were very different from the life world of the experiences of the disadvantaged students. And sometimes they'd be like, oh my God, they'll be enthralled that, oh my God, what a lecture. And this teacher speaks so fluent English and this and that. But after the first week of teaching, I realized they are retaining nothing, because I'm not giving them in a form which is familiar to their life world. I'm not giving examples of concepts from slum life. I'm talking about going to the movie halls and watching good movies and giving examples from there, without realizing that these students do not have the privilege of going to movie halls very frequently. They don't have the privilege of going to vacations frequently. There is a class difference, and that has to be looked into with empathy. I cannot say if I've been a good teacher, but what my students have helped is I can now definitely speak in their language. Now I can give an example of sociological concepts from the slums, from lifestyles that go hungry, from popular culture and not very elitist culture. These I had to grow in myself, and now I know there's a big gap. Cultural training, customized cultural training has to be there for teachers. Teachers have to be prepared for the kind of students that they are receiving, which, I'm sorry to use the word class for want of a better word, which socioeconomic background are they coming from? Which region? What is important in their culture? Only then can a teacher speak in their language, and only then it will appeal. And we as teachers have to just be fine with that some things in the curriculum will never appeal to disadvantaged students, because they were not participants in creation of the curriculum. This is one area. Cultural training is very important. Next, mental health. As I already said with a few data, that we are actually handling a student population which is very vulnerable for mental health for various reasons. I'm not going into the analysis. But coming to a teacher is a great opportunity to fix that. And if not fix that, if you think that is very ambitious, at least we as teachers should not make that worse. But we don't have training. I have interest in psychology. So I picked up what are the basic conditions which inhibit learning. Okay, you have you have brilliant students, but who struggle with anxiety, who struggle with depression, who struggle with mild autism, and their behavior may be just a little different, not according 100% according to the norms of classroom teaching. And when they're coming from disadvantaged sections, the scope of mental, they're not cognitively always ready for taking big lessons. So I had to train myself. What are the learning disabilities? So that I don't over penalize someone for somebody who is already struggling with conditions. So we as teachers don't have to become counselors. That is a different profession. But at least I'll give you an example. I had this student in my class who had to be allowed to change his seat every few minutes in the classroom. If I did not train myself with basic psychology, I would have definitely scolded that student, thrown him out of the class, and worsened his situation. He was actually suffering from a condition called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. And a person struggling with ADHD may have to it's very difficult for them to sit fixed in one place. We had another student who had to be let to go to toilet again and again inside the class. He had to be excused. Why? Because he was suffering from anxiety issues, and it was extremely difficult for him to sit. It was college education, co-ed education was his first exposure, and he had to sit with other female participants, which he was not used to. So he had to go to the toilet because he had this anxiety-driven condition called IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. He had to go to the toilet over and over. So just imagine, this is just two of the very unusual conditions that I said. Just imagine if I was there without this basic psychological training, I would have treated them in a way that would have permanently driven them out of the higher education system. So teachers don't have to be counselors, but teachers, at least this, I guess, can be expected, that teachers will not mishandle situations to drive somebody out. That's all. Teachers should be able to at least identify that this student needs help. I know teachers who actually have penalized students who have come for help. Why? Because the teacher there's no point in blaming the teachers. They don't have training. So these are the two vital areas where there has to be official training. And we cannot leave it to, okay, some teachers are gifted, they will do good at it. Others, let them be whatever they are. We cannot be so casual about it. Coming out from teachers, similar training has to go with the office staff, the administrators, basics of psychological skills, of psychological education, basics of cultural education, what socioeconomic background is my students coming from. These are the basics. And beyond that, an overall culture of compassion has to be built. I'm coming to the end, and what I say is, I consider compassion, we can call it by different names. We can call it empathy in the name of psychology. We can call it compassion in the Buddhist tradition. We can call it karuna, we can call it prem, whatever. At the end of the day, are we generating more compassionate teachers and educators, both office and teaching staff and administrators? If we are able to generate that, what will happen is all these small changes that we are writing down. Okay, number one, this change, number two, this change, number three, this change, for efficiency, for sustainability. The more, we're talking about so many changes, but all those changes will come naturally once we cultivate our skill of compassion, of empathy. Psychological research has advanced greatly to give us a lot of evidence on this. So that is the main point. We do not talk about how to cultivate the heart, we talk about so many. I was going through the United Nations documents and the national education policy documents, and they are wonderful. They wonderfully equip the teacher, but somewhere they just stop before talking about compassion. They will talk about motivation of teachers. Teachers have to be energetic. Teachers have to be this, that, qualified, academically qualified, should have a lot of research papers, but absolute silence when the real skill comes. I want to call compassion a skill. I know I'm making it small, but I want to call it. Why? Probably because compassion and empathy, these are so deep, qualitative, subjective feelings that our research methodology has not yet reached to a place where we can talk about it with a language of, with a quantitative language. It cannot be easily measured. So what we cannot easily measure, we cannot take concrete steps on that. Maybe this is my analysis. Maybe because it cannot be easily measured, we have not talked much about compassion. But it remains the essential skill, which is that one skill being cultivated, a lot of other skills will come more easily. And here comes in the role of spirituality. In a materialistic culture-driven education system, it is so difficult to talk about compassion quantitatively. But at the same time, we find religious traditions across the world have preserved the knowledge of cultivating compassion. How to cultivate the heart faculty, how to cultivate it. That has been preserved by traditions across religious traditions. But that knowledge, sometimes it looks, has fallen in glory, has fallen to disuse. But it has so much more to offer. And I think conferences like this, where there's this attempt to bridge the social and the spiritual, the material and the spiritual, and the so-called religious, these attempts are wonderful because somewhere it gives me hope. We will start talking more about compassion, not as something religious or spiritual, but as something which can be cultivated. We talk about, yes, compassion is good, values are good, this is good, that is good, but very few people tell us how to cultivate. We know of stories of sages, of saints, of so many spiritual masters who have gone step by step and transformed their lives and transformed the lives of others. That is possible because there's a science behind evolving to compassion. We can evolve. That's the good news. We can change our brains. We can change our feeling faculties to feel more compassion. And there lies the only solution to sustainable development. With this, I offer my pranams to everyone present here, and I thank you.